Alrighty, so welcome everyone. And what I'm going to do here just very quickly while I get myself set up is I'm sharing my screen, but I'd like to see the chat window at the same time. So hold on for just give me 1 second here while I get myself nicely set up. And let me see. I might have to actually, okay, there's our chat. Let's see chat. Okay, great. I just want to keep an eye on the chat while I am going through a couple of things here. And I want to just stop the share for 1 second. Chat. Okay, now you all should see Amarna period. Do folks see that? Yep. Okay, great. And Zach, I may need your help in case I lose the chat function, but it will just be the first couple of things that I'm going to be going through. So basically, I'm Lisa Engelbert, and as Zach mentioned, we're not historians here, and I definitely want to point that out. I'm not a historian, but I'm someone that's really interested in ancient history, particularly when it comes to the ancient Near East and Egypt and Greece. So what I wanted to start off with, and what I'm subtitling this presentation is, it's not just about the Amarna letters, but about the Amarna period in general. And I'm subtitling it 30 Years of Revolution based on some of the research that I was doing on this topic. So this, just to give you guys a heads up, this is what I plan to cover over the next, hour and 45, hour and 15 minutes. But I want to basically cover off on the 5 whys, if you will, kind of what the period is. And what I'm subtitling this presentation is, it's not just about the Amarna letters, but about the Amarna period in general. And I'm subtitling it 30 Years of Revolution based on some of the research that I was doing on this topic. So this, sorry, is someone getting feedback, or is that just me? Over the next, hour and 45, hour and 15 minutes. But I want to basically cover off on the 5 whys, if you will, kind of what the period is. And what I'm subtitling this presentation is, it's not very weird about the Amarna letters, but about. Now that was fun. Could everybody go on mute? Maybe there was a mute kind of delay. Let's see. Let's pick it back up and see if we still have the issues happening. Okay. So the agenda is going to be what the Amarna period is, who and what drove the Amarna period. I want to cover off on what reforms were introduced during this very brief period in history, including religion, geographic location, and artistic conventions. And then the last chunk will be around the Amarna letters. And then I'll wrap up with some brief thoughts around legacy of the Amarna period. So just so I get a better understanding of kind of who is in the room, if folks could just use the chat function and enter in an answer to this question. When you hear the phrase Amarna period, what words come to your mind? And if folks could just chat in, what are some things that come to mind when you hear that? Akhenaten. Okay. Akhenaten. Okay. Letters. Akhenaten. Nothing. Never heard of it before. Okay. Akkadian. Reformer Pharaoh. Excellent. All right. So it's kind of across the board, but a lot of people seem to have some familiarity with this fellow, the Pharaoh Akhenaten. Okay. And then the last question is, kind of gauging yourself and your knowledge on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being I have no knowledge at all, and 5 being, I'm very, very familiar. Where do you kind of put yourself in terms of knowing who the characters are from this period, the history of it, what reformations were introduced, and the Amarna Letters. So folks could just, okay, 3 to 4. Okay, I like the 0.5. Excellent. All right, great. So Paul, I'm going to be turning to you maybe to lend some support in the event that I stumble over things.
I'll do what I can.
And Marika, you as well. So thank you. Thank you both in advance. I'm going to go ahead and just go on into my presentation mode. Okay, I'm going to click out of the chat. So I'm not seeing chat right now, just to let folks know. So if you do have a question or something, just feel free to stop me, shout it out. So to start off with, I want to set some context and do a brief definition of what the Amarna period is. And by context, I want to kind of take us back in time to the period that just precedes where the Amarna period is going to fall. And for Egypt, it's called their second intermediate period. It lasts for about 90 to 100 years, between 1640 and 1550 BCE. And it's a time period of great instability and non-unity within Egypt. There are political factions that are vying for power. There are non-native rulers, the Hyksos, who actually come and take power within Egypt. This is a whole nother lecture around the Hyksos, but they were actually people that had settled in Egypt for generations from outside of Egypt. They established a new capital at Abaris, which is in the northeast of Egypt, and they are eventually challenged and overthrown by a group of princes that come from the city of Thebes, which is in the south of Egypt. The period of that the Amarna takes place, the Amarna period takes place, is just a blip within the 18th dynasty, which falls within New Kingdom Egypt. It is considered a golden age of Egypt. There's a great amount of wealth that's come into the country. The Hyksos have been ousted, and the folks that oust the Hyksos are Kamos and Amos, and that's a son and or a grandson and a father or grandfather that over a couple of generations are able to oust the Hyksos. There is a great deal of expansion, and with that expansion comes securing of the borders at a greater distance from the central part of Egypt, as well as an establishment of a great deal of wealth, or wealth that's taken basically from this expansion. With all of these goods that are coming in, the pharaohs do a great deal of building, very intense building programs. So there's a lot of monumental architecture, colossal statues that are that come into being during the beginning of the 18th dynasty. And for the purposes of our discussion, sorry, go ahead. Did somebody have a question? Okay.
No question. Somebody just logged in, forgot to mute.
Oh, that's all right. So the thing that I think is really important to take away from this period is from this slide is that Egypt had come out of a great deal of a difficult time, and then had come back kind of like, here we are, we have great wealth and great power. That power, however, is not just residing with the pharaoh. There's like, if you think of it as almost like a tripod, you've got the pharaoh is very powerful, the military is very powerful, and the priesthood, especially the priesthood of Amun, is extremely powerful at this time. That's going to be important to our story. So the Amarna period, depending on which scholar you read, can last anywhere from 15 to 30 years. So it is really a short period of time. Taking us external to Egypt, we're going to talk about what's going on in the region. Let me see, outside of Egypt. So you've got Egypt here, and then you've also got these other great powers that are of equal status or close to equal status of Egypt. You've got Babylon down in this area here that's under the Kassites. You've also got the kingdom of Assyria, and Assyria at this time is starting to gain more and more kind of power. Previously hadn't been that powerful. And then you've got the kingdom of Mitanni, which is on this map referred to as Hanagalbat. And then the Achaeans and Mycenaeans, or Achaeans/Mycenaeans, are over here in Greece. And then, especially within the context of the Amarna period, this land up here, the land of Hatti, the kingdom of the Hittites, is important. We'll see a couple of reasons why the Hittites play an important role during the Amarna period. Now, of course, Egypt has prior to this time really had a lot of independence, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is the location. It is distant from the Near East regional powers. A second reason is that there are naturally occurring borders, the Mediterranean Sea, the Red Sea, the Sinai Peninsula. And then also, Egypt does not have a dependence on outsiders to procure resources to help the Egyptians survive. There's the annual Nile inundation, which leads to extremely fertile ground. And so the Egyptians are able to self-sustain and feed themselves. So that's kind of the context of what's happening within the time frame of the Amarna period. So what actually is the Amarna period? And the Amarna period is called so because of the location. And the location is called today Tel El Amarna in Egypt. In ancient times, it was called Akhenaten, and we'll talk more about that whole location thing. The period, as I mentioned, is brief, 15 to 30 years. It starts with the reign of Akhenaten and ends, if you go all the way 30 years out, more or less, at the end of the 18th dynasty with the decline of the Pharaoh Horemheb. And what defines it is that it's a period of intense traditions that are disrupted. We have total disruption that's happening, and that happens on every level. It happens at the geographic level, it happens politically, it happens spiritually, and it happens culturally. And to kind of like give you a little taste of what we're going to be talking about during the artistic period, this is an example of how art really goes through a huge transformation. So when I think about Egypt and imagery of Egypt, I think about kind of like the very formalized, forward facing, if it's a wall painting or wall relief, very two-dimensional figures of a pharaoh and a queen. But what you see here is Akhenaten, and he is in a very intimate embrace with one of his daughters. So that is a very significant transformation of how the pharaoh is depicted. And that was a bit about the kind of the context. And now, as folks have mentioned, you can't really talk about this time period without talking about this guy, Akhenaten. So who was he? Akhenaten actually came onto the throne as Amenhotep IV, and Amenhotep means Amun is satisfied, and Amun was the key deity in the region of Thebes in southern Egypt. He was not destined to be the pharaoh. His elder brother, who had been groomed to become the pharaoh, he died unexpectedly. So Amenhotep IV had to ascend to the throne. He was the son of the wealthy, powerful rulers Amenhotep III and Queen T. In his 5th regnal year, he will change his name from Amun is satisfied to effective for the Atsun or Akhenaten. And effective for the Atsun really means that he was kind of the servant, the son of the solar deity named the Atsun, which we'll talk about in more detail in a bit. There is some belief that he may have co-ruled with his father, but that's at least from the reading I was doing is not yet decided if that's the case or not. And during the first couple of years of his reign, it seems like everything, like at least culturally, was maintained from the tradition. What I'm showing you here is something that kind of contradicts earlier scholarship around Akhenaten being this pacifist, this philosopher king that was very insular and didn't care about anything that was going on outside of like his own little world, right? And what you're seeing here is a wall relief from one of the temples at Karnak. And Karnak is a temple complex across from the capital city of Thebes in southern Egypt. And what you're seeing here is a traditional smiting pose that pharaohs for 1,000+ years have been depicted as a sign of power, as a sign of being able to capture and conquer enemies of Egypt. He's in the smiting pose, and in his left hand, which is a little hard to see, he is basically holding the hair of a number of captives. And were we able to see the missing pieces of this wall relief, we would see him holding a mace or a scepter, and he would be ready to strike these enemies in the head. So if we take a look at a traditional um, um, smiting pose from very early times, this is from the Narmer palette, which is one of the, if not the earliest depiction of the pharaoh and some of the traditional iconography that dates to 2950 BCE, which is a full 1500 years before Akhenaten comes onto the throne. So that's a lot of history, right? A lot of time for the tradition to really have become ingrained within the Egyptian culture. What I'm showing you here now, I don't want to talk too much about the artwork that you're seeing, but I wanted you to have kind of like visual cues as to some of the masterpieces that come out of the Amarna period within a smattering of 20 years. It's really incredible how much wonderful artwork was produced. But what I'm going to do is just take you on a quick journey about some of the key milestones during Akhenaten's reign. So first off, in 1353, Amenhotep IV becomes the pharaoh. That's when we find a colossal statue, which I can't remember how tall it is. I think it may be 3 or 5 meters tall. That was found at Karnak, and it was found buried in pieces. In 1349, Amenhotep IV changes his name to Akhenaten, and he makes a decision to leave the spiritual and political center of Thebes, which is a huge undertaking to move the royal court elsewhere. And there are these things called boundary stele that are erected to basically lay out where this new city is going to be located. And we'll look at depth at those boundary stele. The court, about a year to 2 years later, actually makes the move to this new location, and its name is Akhenaten, very similar to Akhenaten, but Akhenaten. And there is recorded the birth of 2 of his daughters. During this year, there are 2 masterpieces produced. There's the head of one of his princesses, one of his daughters, and then the head of his mother, who plays an instrumental role during his reign. There's in 1346, the birth of another daughter. He has 6 in total that we know of. And this is when the bust of Nefertiti is reportedly carved and all. And we'll talk more about that bust. In 1342, there's a couple of really interesting things that happened during this year. And the first is there's the war in Nubia. So remember, I had mentioned that he wasn't just a pacifist. He sent He sent military down into Nubia because Nubia, the kingdom of Kush, was revolting against Egypt. And he basically sent military in there to maintain the border that had been established, and to quell the rebellion. It is also the time of the tribute of the nations, and this is when vassal states of Egypt, as well as some of the greater powers, are invited or expected to pay homage in person to Queen Nefertiti as well as Akhenaten. It's also a very emotional time because there's the death of one of the princesses, Atsun. Out of this time period, the torso of a princess is produced, and we'll look at that one in more detail. 1340, the death of Queen T occurs, and that's his mother. She's up here for that. Excuse me. And there is the suspicion that Nefertiti becomes a co-ruler. Excuse me for 1 second. Apologies for the gulping there. Nefertiti, there's suspicion that she may have become a co-ruler. And excuse me for 1 more second, I'm just going to put myself on mute really quickly here. Hold on. I should have some background music playing when that kind of stuff happens, but that's for another time. Another event that happens that is somewhat interesting and mysterious is that Akhenaten, like other pharaohs during the time in Egypt, he had not just one queen, but at least one other queen, multiple queens likely. And his minor queen, Kia, she kind of disappears from the record, and even some of her imagery is replaced by one of Akhenaten and Nefertiti's daughters. So there's a lot of interesting scholarship around what happened and why this was. It is also a time that this wonderful little statuette in limestone is produced of Nefertiti, and we'll get to see her in more detail later on. In 1336, the key events were Akhenaten dies. The kingship is taken over by kind of an obscure, not much information known about King Smenkhare. And then his reign will be brief, and it will be followed by King Tutankhaten, who we know as King Tutankhamun or King Tut. And then lastly, in 1335, this new location that the court had moved to will be abandoned. Does anybody know what this structure is that I'm showing? And if you do, just go ahead and shout it out.
That's not a Karnak, right? No.
It is at Karnak. You're right.
Okay.
This is Karnak. This is the temple complex of the god Amun. And why I'm showing this is what I want to point out here. If you can barely see, those are people. Here's a garbage can. And I'm showing this because I wanted you to see how enormous this structure is. And this is just one kind of like set of monuments that leads into even more monuments, all dedicated to to this god Amun. And it's right across from Thebes. And I had mentioned earlier in the presentation that the priests had an enormous amount of power. And their power at this time was comparable to the pharaohs. There's already evidence before Akhenaten is the pharaoh that there's tension between the priesthood and other pharaohs. The temple of Amun is not just a religious complex. So the priests are not just responsible for like the spiritual well-being of Egypt, as important as that is. It is also a place where grain and other resources are stored and then redistributed to the general population in Egypt. It is a place where scribes will go to be trained and educated. And not many people, just mostly the scribes, right, have the ability to record things, to communicate things. So they had a great amount of power in being able to communicate. It is also where the booty that's coming in and the loot from these campaigns that generated so much wealth, where a lot of that wealth is actually kept. And records of like taxes and imports and, who has given how much labor and gifts to the king. All of that information is stored within this humongous complex. So the priesthood had enormous amounts of power. We know that Amenhotep the fourth, while he's still called that, built outside this temple complex dedicated to Amun. He built an entirely different complex, which hadn't really been done before by other pharaohs, and he dedicated it to not Amun, but to Re Horakti, who was a solar deity. And there is a relationship between Amun and Re Horakti, but he really focuses on the solar deity, the solar essence of the Egyptian pantheon. There's no trace of it that remains today, except what archaeologists have been able to kind of like piece together, because it was completely destroyed by people who followed in his footsteps and became king. There's no evidence of it. And just touching a bit on how we know about like what was happening at Karnak in terms of at least this kind of like this temple complex that Amenhotep IV built. And what we're looking at here is basically like scaffolding. It's an archival photo of scaffolding that was used to kind of like deconstruct pylon 10, which if we look back, this is a pylon. These things are huge. And what they would do was, and all of the builders of these things would do, is they would have nice outside walls, but then they would fill the inside to add stability to it with rubble. It just like, it could be from other buildings from previous king's buildings and all. It could just be, blocks of rock or something. But the clues at Karnak were that at pylon 10, when the pylon was actually being kind of like just shored up, and there was some reconstruction that was being done during I think it was starting in the 20th century, that there were these building block things that were found, things that are about this size here, kind of like little flagstones or something. And they were finding that these blocks were reused as fill inside the pylon. And they found on these little blocks these inscriptions and reliefs that were painting a story that was a little bit different than what had been understood up until this time. There was, first of all, descriptions of the sun disk, and the sun disk becoming very important because other deities that Egypt was worshiping were failing. They had shortcomings and they were not sufficient. So there was emphasis being put on this sun disk, which was kind of a radical concept. And then there was also part of an actual inscription saying that there are events worse than those heard by any kings who had ever assumed the white crown. And by assuming the white crown, it's when a pharaoh actually takes on the crown of Upper Egypt, which is in the south. So there was a lot that was going on. Something was afoot, and archaeologists were starting to uncover that there might be more to Karnak than had been previously understood. This is kind of a rabbit hole, but I think it's really interesting and important to kind of point out, because those building blocks that I'm talking about look like this, and they're called Teletots, which I'll talk more about when I talk about urban planning. And there were about 25 1,000 of these little fragments that were found, and they're about, I guess, like hand widths wide. No, so 25,000 were found. And originally, when they were found, the archaeologists, the people that found them, they knew that they were important and that they told a story, and they just started storing them in like these giant storage areas at Karnak. And they understood, they're starting to get this sense that there was this temple dedicated to Re Harakti, dedicated by this guy Amenhotep IV, but they think his name is Akhenaten, or it might be another pharaoh. They're starting to kind of put these pieces together, but there's no way you can manually put together 25,000 of these blocks. It's like doing a jigsaw puzzle without the edges, right? And so there's this retired diplomat, American diplomat, who's also a huge archaeologist fan, and he's also really into technology. This is during the 1960s, and he comes up with this approach that, hey, what we need to do is use computers to help figure out like what this complex looked like that this guy Amenhotep IV or Akhenaten built. And so he has people photograph in a very specific manner all these Teletots, inter-identifying data, and then start to digitally reconstruct the temple. And that continues to that day, that methodology. So that's kind of like about Akhenaten. Does anybody have any questions before I go on to the reforms?
I can add something about the art. The first figure that you show of
Yes.
Akhenaten with his daughter,
Yes.
it was very, very revolutionary because at the time, until that time, kids were represented in a very small scale. I mean,
Yes.
not smaller because they were kids, but they were very, very small. And they have certain attributes. They were naked, that means that they were kids. And I think they were doing something like sucking a thumb or something like that. And with Akhenaten, the size of the daughter is like a real kid. So it's not only that, it's totally revolutionary to change the tradition of, it's like changing the letters. The letters were one way or another. Well, with Akhenaten, that was a very, very revolutionary thing to convert the figures much more human, much more deformed, and more real size. So that's what I would like to add.
Let me add something to what Marika just said, which is that you got to understand that the iconography of Egypt almost never changed. So the iconography in the Ptolemaic period would have been, which is to say, when the Greeks were holding Egypt, would have been recognizable in the Old Kingdom. So I'm just underscoring that what Marika says, it was really unusual. Things didn't change in the iconography of Egypt.
I love that. Thank you both. That is excellent points to really hone in on that. Thank you. So I'll go ahead and move us on then to what's happening in terms of belief reforms that are happening. And I came across one scholar that summed it up as Akhenaten is looking at this solar deity as being a single governing principle of life. Which is really important, and we'll go into more details about what that really means. But just thinking about it, and some people have interpreted this as being he's the first monotheist and all, which I will, say that that's not the latest scholarship in terms of the thinking around his reforms. And what you're looking at here, I just found this a beautiful piece of artwork, is a pair of hands, if you could see both of them, that's holding the Atsun cartouches. And so a cartouche is basically this oval kind of like enclosure, and it's enclosing the name of traditionally only the pharaoh and the queen. They before Akhenaten and after Akhenaten, deities are never presented with enclosed in this cartouche. So already there's a lot of revolution that's going on, even in this artistically, in portraying a deity's name and all. And another thing that's interesting is that, you know, this is a solar deity, and one of the hieroglyphs that's related to it, I'll zoom in on this, you know, has to do with the horizon. So you see two kind of like hills, and you have this rising sun that's coming up between the hills. Talking a bit about, actually, you know, when I always thought about Akhenaten, I always thought about, oh my gosh, he just completely like blew everything away, and he just had these crazy ideas and he introduced them. But actually, there had been some movement towards some of his reforms, certainly not at all to the point that he changes things. But what is actually in existence is there is this belief in a solar deity, and it's not only that there's a deity or set of deities related to the sun, but also that they have life-giving powers. There's already the belief that a single divine force governs others, meaning that they are kind of like the head of the pantheon, and they are kind of like the overseers of the other deities. So this already exists, but the head of the deities is Amun. This dates to the third dynasty, King Djoser. So we're talking about, you know, over 2,000 years before. This is already kind of a concept and an idea. During the 18th dynasty, before Akhenaten takes the kingship, there's already a more emphasis on solar deities and a little less on Amun. There's new religious texts that have come out, which is new. And then there's also, and we'll see a depiction of it, there is this, you know, image of the kind of like a sun disk with enveloping arms that's already present in a few instances of artwork. So these things are in existence. Where Akhenaten really takes things to a very, very different level is that he promotes the Atsun, this solar deity, to the exclusion of all others. He's not paying attention to any others. There is this concept of a deity triad, and at Thebes, that triad had been Amun, Mut, who is his consort, and she's a creator deity, and their son Khons. And they are replaced with Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and the Atun. So why this is important is because, unlike other pharaohs all the way up through Egyptian history, he is being considered, or seeks to be considered as worshipped as a living god. Every other pharaoh up until this time is worshipped as a god upon their death, but never when they are alive. He is a spiritual teacher, so he feels like responsible as the spiritual leader of all of Egypt. And he believes in truth and righteousness, not just upon death and having the judgment and the weighing of the heart against a feather to see if, you know, you have led a just life, but he believes in truth and righteousness every single day, and that's how people should be judged. And then also he focuses on the present and the daily recreation of the world with the sunrise. Previously, the focus had been on the kind of like the afterlife and eternity and what's happening after death. So how widespread was Akhenaten's belief reforms? And during, actually, not even during his early reign, but throughout his reign, commoners as well as like high-ranking court officials, they continue to worship other gods. So the other gods are not completely obliterated and forgotten. And there's evidence of that by a number of these like amulets and pieces of jewelry and little statuettes that have been found in the shape of other gods. And these were found actually at Akhenaten's new location at Amarna. This is the goddess Taweret, who is the goddess of childbirth and fertility. And this is the god Bes, who's the protector of households, mothers, and children. There's also quite a bit of evidence of the worship of the goddess Hathor, who's a solar and sky deity, and she's associated with the pharaoh. There's at this point in time, no effort to erase the Egyptian pantheon. And in fact, there are records found at Amarna that share payments and goods did continue to flow into temples other than those where the Atsun was worshipped. However, the bulk of all of that resource went into the temples for the Atsun, but there was still attention that was paid to other temples and other gods. Late in the reign, there is evidence of decline at Amarna, and we see that Akhenaten takes some radical steps. And one of those steps includes an active campaign to remove iconography of the god Amun at Karnak. And that includes like chipping away of some of the images of Amun as well as the name of him. There's been a couple of theories as to why that happened. One is that there were problems that were happening at Amarna, and Akhenaten was looking for something to kind of place blame on, like Amun is kind of fighting me on this transformation. Another theory I saw, and again these are not proven, is that this was an effort to undermine the priesthood of Karnak and the powerful priesthood of Amun. So I'm moving now away from belief and moving on to actually the move to Akhenaten. What you're seeing here is a 3D model recreation of the great Atsun temple at Amarna, and it is facing the horizon. So you remember I showed you that part of the hieroglyph a hieroglyph, but for spelling out the Atsun. And this is kind of why I wanted you to see that hieroglyph, because you can see here is the landscape, and a couple of times a year, I understand, at Akhenaten, you can actually see the sun come up between some similar cliffs, and also you have that beautiful image of a sun coming up over the horizon. So where is Akhenaten? It is here, and it's listed as Tel-el-Amarna or El-Amarna. Up here, Memphis was traditionally a power center for earlier kingships, as was Thebes down here in the south, and Karnak and Luxor are where there's the great temples that we took a look at earlier. Akhenaten translates to horizon of the Atun. It is virgin, or was virgin land. It was very flat, very exposed, and very, very hot, extremely inhospitable. It was remote. It was right in between Memphis and Thebes. And when Akhenaten established this, he thought of it not as a city, but actually as sacred landscape that was dedicated to the worship of the Atsun. And what's really fascinating to me is that it was complete ground up construction. Nothing existed there whatsoever. So here is an interesting diagram that I like, that shows you a little bit more of a zoomed in view. This here is the Nile. This here on the eastern side of the Nile is where the main kind of like central part of Akhenaten is built up and established. You have here something that is called Bar Yusuf, or the Canal of Joseph, which was an alternative way to kind of like transport goods or to travel in the event that there were Nile inundations or a low Nile. And then what I really wanted to call your attention to is you see these lines here, these dotted lines. These are outlining basically the boundary of this sacred landscape. These letters are indicative of these boundary stelae that were put in place with proclamations of what this sacred landscape is about and why it's here and how it got there. And there are, I think they've determined that there are about 15 or 16 of them. I can't remember exactly how many um, that have been found, but they're really, really interesting. And we're going to take a closer look at one of them momentarily. What you're seeing here is just another view, and this is an artist rendition of the layout of kind of like the central area of this sacred landscape. And the first thing here is this humongous temple that's dedicated to the Atsun. And for those of you that are familiar with kind of temple architecture, does anybody see anything that looks different from what you may be used to in looking at a temple? Just anything, and you can shout it out.
There are right angles.
They're right angles. Oh, okay, interesting. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I'll share with you one of the things that really makes this a unique temple architecture is that this has no roofing. This is completely exposed. And it was an attempt to basically expose everything to the Atsun, the sun, and all. So imagine it's so hot and inhospitable, and this is completely open. Another thing that is interesting is that this here is the Great Palace. So this is where the royal residency is. And there are these huge open and exposed courtyards that are also present. Again, this whole philosophy around exposure to the sun is really important. I mentioned the boundary stele. This is an example of just one of them. And this is considered Stele U, and it's from the 6th year of Akhenaten's reign. It is more or less 10 meters tall, because these are very significant, large structures. And it is carved in what's called living rock, meaning that it wasn't something that was chiseled and, like a rock taken from one place and erected someplace else. This is actually part of a cliff. On either side here, what you see are statues of Akhenaten and what would have been Nefertiti. On the other side would have been statues of his two of his daughters. Up at the top of this boundary stele is basically Akhenaten, who's here. You could barely see him. You kind of see like a belly and some little spindly legs. And then over here is Nefertiti, and again, you see kind of like large thighs and somewhat smaller legs and all. And they are worshiping the Atsun. And this would be a solar disk if you could see it better, if it had better remains. And these are rays that are caressing Akhenaten and Nefertiti. On the next kind of like register or area where you see all of these hieroglyphs, what you find is the foundation proclamation for this sacred space. And in it, what we see is that it's a place to worship the Atsun. It's not a city. Akhenaten calls that out specifically. There are references to an actual urban plan, including we're going to have this many temples, we're going to have a palace, we're going to have a sun temple for Nefertiti. And also, we're going to have a decree that should any member of the royal family die when they're away from this sacred landscape, that they will be buried here at Akhenaten. Just briefly, here's a beautiful quote from this stele is, as the Atsun is beheld, the Atsun desires that there be made for him as a monument with an eternal and everlasting name. It was the Atsun, my father, who advised me concerning it, so that it might be made for him as Akhenaten. Akhenaten, the pharaoh, has been very clear that the Atsun, the solar deity, is the one that chose this sacred landscape, that it was not the pharaoh or anyone else that chose it. We talked about belief reforms. We talked about making this move. I mentioned that it required ground up construction. So that required a huge amount of urban planning innovations, which really, in my mind, kind of blow me away, like how quickly this landscape was turned into a functioning city. So first off, I find this really interesting was that this kind of like the central part of the sacred landscape where there's the great temple, where there is the royal palace, as well as some of the other more critical buildings, was laid out on a one-to-one model. So just imagine it was like a life-size blueprint. And according to the archaeologist Barry Kemp, who heads up now, he's the director of the Amarna project, so he's on site directing the archaeology there. First, what happened was the builders laid out a foundation in gypsum concrete. The second, the structures, the main structures, were kind of like marked out with some kind of like drawing utensil where they should be located. And this allowed both skilled and unskilled labor to come in and place those Talots stones that we saw an image of, you know, those little broken up stones, could actually be brought and placed in line within this blueprint, this living blueprint. I mentioned these Teletots, and these are the building blocks which really changed construction for the Amarna period. And they were small enough for one man to handle, which was really very different from what previously the Egyptians had used, which was these huge stone pieces that required multiple people to transport them. And required like winches and devices to roll these stones along or float these stones along. These were small enough that one person could still handle them. They weren't light, but they could still handle them. And Talotot in Arabic means three, and that's the measure of 3 hands across. Another thing that was very different at Akhenaten is that the great temple of the Atsun is actually the nucleus. That is really the focus. Previously, temples had been like at Thebes, a whole temple complex had been built across the Nile at a sacred temple structure. That was not the case at Akhenaten. It was actually the kind of like the keystone to this new location. Neighborhoods were pretty interesting because although the central part of Akhenaten had been laid out and kind of overseen, there was this concept of neighborhoods that arose. And the neighborhoods sprung up around people that were connected and powerful and had close ties to the royal court. And they would build up these followings of people that would support them and provide them with help and supplies and labor as needed. But these leaders, or you know, little neighborhood mayors, if you will, they also, you know, the more power that they gained, the better that they were viewed by Akhenaten and Nefertiti. They also would rise up in stature, and they would take along with them their followers. So you wanted to be associated with a neighborhood and a leader or a mayor that was kind of going up in the ranks. These neighborhoods and the non-royal and non-sacred sections of Akhenaten were self-organized. They were just like, you know, figure out how to kind of build, which I'm fascinated with. Burials changed, whereas previously burials had been facing the west and the setting of the sun, they would now be facing the east. And then lastly, there is a lot of attention paid to the harmony of nature and its congruity with the city and these intersections between nature and city. Okay. Moving on now to tombs. And this has been really interesting because tombs have led to a lot more knowledge as to what happened at this place, Akhenaten, and what was life like there. And what we find actually is, besides like royal tombs and the tombs of viziers, one of the greatest finds has been a cemetery that had at least 3,000 burials, 200 of which I understand have actually been like really studied. And the story that it paints is rather disheartening. And one is that there is a shorter lifespan at Akhenaten or Amarna than the average Egyptian. So people that were 35 years and younger were found in these burials. There was evidence of a very poor diet. Some of the burials were extremely haphazard and sloppy, indicative of, there was a rush to bury these bodies. There were injuries sustained by the skeletal systems, which is a sign of hard labor. Although there's smaller building blocks that they were using, they're still seeing that they're finding evidence of a lot of spinal injuries that had taken place, a lot of broken bones. And then there is evidence of a disease outbreak, and that might explain why we have these haphazard burials and why there's such such a young population that's buried there. Uh, we'll learn a generation later from outside of Egypt during the Hittite king Mursili II's reign that a plague broke out in the land of Hatti, or the Hittite kingdom. And he believes that it came with Egyptian prisoners that his father had captured and brought into the Hittite kingdom. And that's a generation after the Amarna period. So it may be that's at Amarna, there was this outbreak of disease that then was infiltrated the Hittite kingdom by virtue of prisoners being taken. So that's about kind of like the city and what was happening there. And now we'll go into artistic reforms that took place as well, to kind of like piggyback on what both Paul and Marika were saying. So these quotes, philosophical and truthful versus repulsive and grotesque, are actual quotes from various archaeologists that have studied the Amarna period. And what it's designed to show is that, people had very strong reactions to this, either really love it or really hate it. So starting off here, which is a little less known, this is basically examples of faience, which is a glazed baked earthenware, and it reaches its height as a craft during the Amarna period. There's several of these workshops that are found at Amarna. They served as decorative elements ranging from covering floors to walls to temple pylons and temple decorations. And then there were also like containers and the cold objects that I showed earlier of the two deities, those were in faience. There's also some use in decorative elements for funerary things like masks and coffins. What you see here are pieces that are, beautiful. This is part of a duck. This is another part of a duck and a fish. Again, kind of like hearkening back to this obsession with nature and abundance. And these pieces are actually from homes, well-off homes, but certainly from homes. And these would be basically, they believe, would have decorated these structures here like pylons of the great temples at this Amarna location. And also imagine all of these being not this, sandy colored, but actually very colorful and decorated with this faience. Another craft that really came into its own during the Amarna period is glassmaking. And Egyptian glassmaking is actually kind of late to the game in terms of their other crafts that they become very gifted in. And this starts after the ousting of the Hyksos, so the 16th century BCE. The kind of glass is called Libyan desert glass, and based on the materials that you're using to create glass, it's going to give you certain shades, and this is kind of the range of the shades of Libyan desert glass. Up until the Amarna period, Glass was a definite luxury item, really something that was the reserve of the royal court. And it was for little tiny things like cosmetic containers or scented oil containers. During the Amarna period, even out in the residential neighborhoods, there are finds of glass items like amulets and jewelry. Here are some, I think, masterpieces from the Amarna period. And why I wanted to show this to you is because although these vases are rather, complex, they're not created using the blown glass method, which is what I think of. You got this long tube and you blow this heated liquid and it becomes glass. They actually, what the glass makers would do is take a long stick, and at the end of it, they would shape a core in the vessel's form that's made of clay or dung or plant remains. They would then heat this core until it's super, super hot, and they would roll it in powdered glass over and over again until the desired thickness is attained. The decoration, like the slide that we saw previously of these long rods, is then sauntered onto the actual vases here, and it would be heated up, and then they would use certain tools to pull it and make designs out of it. And then at the end of it, when they were satisfied with the decoration and the object and all, the core would be broken up and removed from inside. Other crafts that really took off included bronze. We have an example of cartouches of Akhenaten and the Atsun here that are embossed in bronze. We also have an artist's rendition based on archaeological evidence of what leather would look like, how it was used to decorate, say, the chariot, as well as the horses kind of like cover, their rein, their bridle and bits. That was made out of leather as well. This is again an artist's rendition based on what has been found at Amarna. And then another thing was this here, and it's called cobalt blue pottery, which was unique to the Amarna period. This certain color blue, maybe because of the clay, the minerals that were in the clay, it had a certain color to it. And then this is where I think people are a little bit more familiar with some of Akhenaten and Nefertiti's portraiture. And so I subtitled this Kodak Moments, and I'll tell you a bit more about this and why and all. So in terms of like how royal portraiture really transforms, the content is we have the Atun, the ever-present Atun, the solar deity. And it is has these hands or these rays that are reaching down, and they terminate in these little hands. And the hands are always shown handing something very important, such as Ankh, the gift of life and life-giving force, to Nefertiti and Akhenaten. This is Akhenaten, this is Nefertiti, and their princesses. So they're always being caressed by the solar deity. We have the representation of this Holy Trinity. So again, instead of seeing like Amun, Mut, and Khons, the actual deities, we see the Aten, Akhenaten, and Nefertiti. We have the Kodak moment, and that is this, like intimacy. I mean, this could be something that we hang up on our wall in our homes today, right? A family portrait. It's very intimate. It shows like joy, and we'll also see an example of the royal family in grief. The presence of royal women is really important. The princesses are there and present in the portraiture. We see Nefertiti a lot alone, as well as with Akhenaten. And to Marika's point and Paul's point about the kind of like the what's called hierarchic scale, Akhenaten and Nefertiti are basically depicted as they may have been, at least in terms of size-wise, compared to each other, right? They're on the same scale. Normally the pharaoh is portrayed as being much bigger than than his queen, and so this is unusual as well in this kind of a portrait. And then we have the absence of all other deities. In terms of technique, the way that the artists in Egypt would depict human figures is they had this actual grid, a grid of 18 squares. And when Akhenaten was in power, that grid grew, it stretched out to being 22 squares. So everything got really extended out, really stretched out. There is movement and depth in relief art. We don't have this kind of like two-dimensionality where everything is kind of like, frozen in time and very stiff. We have like children being caressed and coddled. We see like slouching of the figures. And there's a great deal more depth that's added to these figures. You can see these deep grooves to give more dimensionality and 3D aspects in these wall reliefs. And that's new during the Amarna period as well. You have this thing called a contact figure, and a contact figure reminds me of something out of the Renaissance, and maybe it is something that the Renaissance artists would use, 1,000 years later, what have you. And that is this small little creature, 1,500 years later, whatever. But this small princess is on the lap of one of her parents, and she's looking at her one parent, and she's looking at Nefertiti, but then she's kind of pulling the whole scene together by pointing at her father, Akhenaten. And so this is what's called a contact figure, and that is unique to the Amarna period. We also have the introduction of something called composite statuary, and I'll show you specific examples in just a moment what that actually means, but think of it as Legos. And then also something that's really important is there is a great deal of diversity that's happening during the Amarna period. It's not, everybody doesn't always look like this. There's other representations. Here is a sketch of a wall relief that's very difficult to see in real life. And this is from the royal tomb at Amarna. And I wanted to show this because it shows the other kind of Kodak moment where the royal family is mourning. And what they are mourning is the death of their second born, Akhenaten, the princess, and she has died. You see Nefertiti and Akhenaten here, and they are obviously grieving. There's one reaching out and grasping the hand of the other in grief and seeking comfort. And then there's also this kind of like mysterious figure here, which is a woman that is shown holding this little tiny, presumably a baby. And so the most recent scholarship has made the guess that basically the princess Akhenaten had died in childbirth. And further research shows that she may or may not have been taken as Akhenaten's minor queen. Here's another depiction, which has a little bit more kind of traditional iconography that we associate with a pharaoh, right? And this is happening during the Amarna period as well. We see Akhenaten on a war chariot, and we see Nefertiti actually on a war chariot as well, which is, again, that's not something that's too usual that we see in Egyptian art. They are being caressed by the Atsun with the rays, and they are surrounded by their military. And so this is thought to be, a couple of things. One is that a depiction of the military might of the royal couple, and it also could be depicted as I am making changes, and maybe everybody in Egypt isn't bought into it, but I have the military behind me. That is one theory that I read about, but it's not 100% sure if that's true. Sculpture, you saw a little bit of a preview of it. This is a sculpture. It's a colossal statue that was found at Karnak. It was buried, and it was part of the processional or temple entrance to the temple of Re-Harakti that Amenhotep the fourth had erected, and it's in what's called the traditional Osiride style. So you see kind of a mashup of different things going on. You have a traditional stance, which is the pharaoh has the hands crossed in front of his chest and then is wearing this very, very tight fitting kilt. And those are indicative of kind of like a burial and mummification. And that's related to the god of the underworld, Osiris. So while you have this elongated face, while you have this really pronounced, unbelievable collarbone and these little spindly arms and a kind of a pot belly, you still have some iconography that's harkening back to the tradition of Egyptian pharaonic depiction.
Hey, Lisa?
Yes.
Yeah, I started, or I joined late, so I'm not sure if it's okay just to interrupt and ask a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So regarding the statue on the right, the only statue, I was told by a doctor that the face, the elongated face, was indicative of possibly of incest.
Genetic disorders.
Yeah, exactly. And also, and this is something I didn't notice with this statue before, but I've heard about it about Tutankhamun, that another manifestation of that, at least with men, is curved hips. And this guy has hips a lot of women would like.
Yes, yes. So excellent. I'm glad that you asked that question, Mark. And I think I'm getting to it in just a moment.
Oh, sorry.
No. You're great. You're like my plants. That's what it is. But the thing that about this particular statue is that it's just one of, I think, 25 plus that have been found at Karnak. These are colossal statues, and they are all a little bit different. One of them is kind of this infamous sexless colossal, which people have made lots of guesses about what it may be, but it may actually be Nefertiti. So some of the theories about the presentation of, why is Akhenaten depicted this way? One is that because there are no longer any other gods that he is really celebrating besides the Atsun and the giver of life, the solar deity, that he and Nefertiti along with the Atsun are actually responsible for all creation and fertility of the entire country of Egypt. There's another theory that it's showing kind of this stretching between the terrestrial and the earthly and the celestial plane. So purposely depicting as not quite human and not quite a god. Another is that the creator and creatrix, so kind of like the male and female, are merged into one vessel. So there's not really such a thing as a sex. And then the original was, which is what I understand is fallen out of favor, is that there was some genetic disorder, and that's why he's depicted as he was. Did that answer your question, Mark?
Yeah, except that I thought I had seen that same elongated face on other statues as well.
Absolutely. You'll see that on, you mean within Akhenaten's iconography?
No, I'm thinking of other pharaohs or other Egyptian statues, I thought.
Now, I don't know about that. Does anybody else know about that? Other pharaohs that were depicted similarly?
I don't think so. I think that this, the elongated face and the bulbous back of the head, which we noticed both for the children and the principals, I think that's unique to Akhenaten and his period.
Okay, thanks.
Yep, that's what I had understood as well. And another thing I think is really important is that we're looking at this colossal statue face on, right? But a colossal statue, by virtue of it being humongous, is we would be on the ground and looking up at it. And I couldn't, unfortunately, find a really good example of looking up at it, but we wouldn't be seeing it in this context. So it would probably change our perspective a bit about what this would look like. I mentioned as well that there is a great amount of diversity. I have only known Akhenaten to be depicted like that colossal statue, right? Really stretched out and elongated and all. This is Akhenaten. This is a bust of Akhenaten, and you can see that he has breasts here. And this also is Akhenaten, and and he's in a more traditional portrayal as the pharaoh. And these occur very close to one another in terms of timing. So it wasn't just reserved to one set of an artistic canon and how to depict the royal family. It was rather diverse. Different scholars debate, why this could be the case, and one is that, there was a more radical sculptor at Karnak that was doing the colossal statues by the name of, I think his name was Beck. And then there was another sculptor at Amarna that had a more moderated style, and his name was Thutmose. He did the Nefertiti bust. But more and more of these scholars, I believe, are arriving at the conclusion that it was kind of a mashup of styles, and they could overlap throughout the whole Amarna period. I mentioned composite statuary, and so this is an example of what I mean by a composite statuary. This is an unfinished head of the Queen Nefertiti. And what you see here is kind of like, I think it's called a tenon. I forgot what the name of it is, but there's also one up here. And what do those things actually do? They're meant to be put together just like Legos. It's pretty ingenious, and it allowed for, like, say, a more unskilled sculptor to work in a large workshop, such as the workshop of Thutmose, and do things that are, less risky. Maybe he was working on the actual bust here, and then the more gifted sculptors would be working on the face as well as the crown. But these would all come together into like one statue, and that allowed for like mass production and more to be produced, which I think is pretty amazing that they were able to do that. And it's something that will last only during the Amarna period.
Question, Lisa.
Yes.
You mentioned the possibility of that Nefertiti was joint ruler.
Yes.
She seems to be wearing the crown of Lower Egypt. Is that part of why that theory has been advanced? Because they seem to be sharing the two crowns in a lot of these iconography.
So that is a really interesting question. So as I understand it, this crown is actually, it's not quite that crown that you're referring to. It is her unique crown, and she wears a crown that no other queen or king is going to wear. And it's the crown that we're going to see on the bust that is in the Berlin Museum. But it was a crown that was unique only to her, as I understand it.
Lisa?
Sorry, let me just finish with Paul.
Sure.
Did you have something to add, Paul?
No, go ahead.
Okay, and then one other point, just to finish up on that, is that the reason that there's suspicion that she may have co-ruled is because during the latter part of Akhenaten's reign, there is this person that starts to become more and more mentioned in the archives, and that person's name is Atsun. Nefertiti at this time is starting to disappear, and we see kind of like this person coming in that may have been co-ruler named Atsun. So that's why there's suspicion or a theory now that she may have kind of relinquished her queenship and become more of a co-ruler officially and changed her name. But that's not 100% sure. CM, you started to speak.
Yes, sorry, it's Claire. Hi there. I was just wondering, this is just slightly back to the point of, and I don't know if you already mentioned this, but in terms of the kind of like the bi-gender looking statues, I was just wondering in any, and please let me know if you already mentioned this, but like in ancient Egypt, was there any, if this was a genetic disorder, was it almost perceived as like, you know, a spiritual or some sort of deity-esque, like, um, you know, if someone was born with these features, that it was considered a spiritual thing? Because I know in ancient Greece there was sort of this like reverence giving to hermaphrodites or something like that. I don't know if there was any cross, or was it just, you know, kind of having both male and female features was considered powerful as well, or
I don't know in terms of like historical beyond the Amarna period. So I
Mm-mm.
don't know that I have an answer for you on that. I
Mhm.
do believe just in what I was reading that there was there's suspicion that there was a concerted effort to kind of show this as, you know, male, female, kind of all packaged in one, and that was some that was unique to the Amarna period and Akhenaten and Nefertiti.
Wow, kind of like yin and yang, or like nothing like that. It's just like,
Maybe I don't know that I have enough knowledge to be able to say, yeah, that's exactly what they were trying to accomplish. I
mm,
don't know.
God, okay.
Yeah. If anybody else on the call wants to share anything that they think, please feel free.
I've heard that about epilepsy and Caesar.
Oh, really?
That might be a pop culture sort of thing. Maybe someone else might know better than I, but I've heard of that.
Well, it's in Plutarch. Plutarch talks about it, about Caesar having epilepsy, and some suggestion that maybe it was some type of divine possession.
Oh, mm-hmm. This is like
Yeah,
the
that's cool.
outline. Interesting.
On the
Alrighty.
hermaphrodite thing, you know, there's a very famous Hellenistic statue of a
Right.
hermaphrodite, but the Hellenistic period was a period in which the grotesque was celebrated.
Oh, okay.
Okay, great. The only thing that I seem to recall is that I think Pepi II, when he ascended to become Pharaoh, there was a expedition down into, oh my gosh, I don't know if it was Nubia or Punt, I can't remember where, but the greatest kind of like treasure that came back was a dwarf. And that was gained a lot of excitement at the court, and whether that was considered to be kind of like this is a person. If it was disrespectful, respectful, or just interesting, I don't know. But I do recall reading something about Pepi too being very excited that there was this dwarf that had been brought back to the court.
I think it was from the trip of Punt.
Right.
And
Yeah, I
yeah,
think the
and it
trip of
was
Punt.
very, yeah.
So yeah, it was an expedition by Pepi to the land of Punt, which is Nubia and you know, and Somalia, so to speak, and they brought back pygmy.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Cool.
Okay. All right. Moving on to this very well-known statue of Nefertiti. And it's showing again kind of this diverse representation of royalty. You know, we see her, she's presented in this very beautiful stylized way, presented as very young. There's serenity, there's youthfulness. She's wearing this kind of like special crown that she has. And this is unusual for a couple of reasons. One is that this is not a finished product. This was actually to be used as a model in the workshop of Tutmos at Amarna. So it's not finished. That there's not a missing eye, that just never was completed. And another reason it's unusual is because it's a bust. And Egyptian art did not normally have many representations of the pharaoh in the bust form. Busts just weren't in fashion.
Let me ask a question about the color. Is
Yes.
that all original? Has it been restored?
That is a really good question. It's painted limestone. I know that has gone through restorations, and I don't know if this has been touched up. I would assume so, but I can't.
I think about that because the convention in Egyptian art was for women to have pale skin,
Yes.
and the men were out working, and they were ruddy with a very reddish complexion.
Hmm.
But this is unusual for a depiction of a woman.
Hmm. Yeah. I know that they it seems like every so often there's new technology that's used. Spectrography, I think, is one that's used to try and determine what were the original pigments and all, just so they have a bit more information. Also, if there's anything within the actual limestone that would be helpful in
Right.
understanding
I mean, there are statues from Greece where there are tiny traces of pigment,
more.
and they're almost 1,000 years after this, and
Mhm.
nothing survives with this level
Preservation.
yeah.
Finish.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Well, I wonder too if some of it has to do with climate and where it was found, what kind of conditions it was found in. I don't know. And then over here we have another representation of Nefertiti, which is extremely different, right? It's not this celebration of youth and beauty in our conventional way of thinking about it, right? But we first, starting off with her head, she has this elongated head, and I'll talk a bit more about that in the next slide. But an elongated head. She is slouching. She has, breasts that are, they're not upright as much as they probably were in youth. She's got an extended belly and larger thighs. And she's also depicted as naked almost, but I think she's actually wearing like a sheath or something. She's not completely naked, but we do see her as a naked older woman that's wearing sandals as well. So you have totally different ways of viewing this royal person. When it comes to depictions of the princess, you see again this kind of use of this egg shaped for the skull. And one theory was that it's egg shaped because it's a sign of creation and fertility and rebirth. We see the torso of a princess, or maybe Nefertiti. I think that there's kind of debate about that still. And the artistic rendition on both these pieces and all these pieces, I think, is just phenomenal because you have this sense of transparency, although she is wearing something, right, covering her body, but you see all the contours of her body. There's a real emphasis on female characteristics. And again, they think that this harkens back to this kind of celebration of fertility and female attributes.
Some people have looked at
Lisa,
this and thought that it's proof of space aliens.
Yes, I did. People have, I mean, they've said that about the pyramids as well. I think that you're going to find aliens responsible for pretty much anything.
Lisa,
Yes.
I think maybe the shape of the head is because they were going to wear wigs, and maybe that's easier to put a wig. I mean, give a nice shape to the wig, because I've seen figures like that, but with wigs, and the wigs,
Okay.
they look much fuller. So
I
maybe
see.
it's not
Okay.
that they want to show the head like that, but they want
Huh.
to include the, I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know about the wig so much, but I know that at least for the crowns, they use that composite statuary. That kind of like tenon or what have you. That bump, the Lego piece in order to fit something on top. So I don't know if they would do the same for a wig or not.
I
Honestly,
think
that's
I
a
think
good.
that some of the reliefs also show the bulbous head,
Yes,
and
they
that would
do.
argue against it being used for a wig because the relief obviously stands alone. No
That
one's
is
putting a wig
true.
on that.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have one of those images, but there is a beautiful, if anybody Googles it, there's a beautiful depiction of two princesses, I believe, very colorful with these elongated heads in a wall relief or wall painting.
Can I just ask a question? Is
Absolutely.
there a thought that that actually is her skin color or was her skin color? I mean, after all, you know, in East Africa, there are tribes, you know, with high cheekbones, with a nose like that. You know, I'm not talking about West African tribes, but in East Africa, definitely like the Maasai, for example. They're not the only, I mean, there are many, many tribes, but that's one example where you'll have similar features. And in the northern part of Kenya, I forget the names of the tribes actually. I just wonder, is that a thought that's out there? Or not?
I did not come across that. I know that there was quite a bit of work that was done in this stone called red quartzite, which is, both of these are examples of that. I don't know if it had to do with materials, and the one on the left is an unfinished product. So I'm not sure, but I think Paul also mentioned that traditionally, yes, the Egyptian queens were depicted with lighter skin, or Egyptian women were depicted with lighter skin, indicative of being more indoors. So I'm not 100% sure. I can't answer that one.
Right.
Yeah.
And also
Also,
head shape
in
can
terms
be,
of,
go ahead.
no, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think your head shape can be influenced like in a child. Isn't it possible? Aren't there some cultures where, I don't know how you do it, you know, by wrapping something around or whatever, you can probably create that kind of head shape, can't you? During development, you know, when the child's skull is soft. I just wonder if there is a thought that there might have been a cultural practice back then of influencing the shape of the head to create something that's considered more beautiful.
You know, interesting, because I do recall what it is that you're speaking of. I think there may have been some native tribes here in the U.S. that had some kind of
Right.
skull shaping, if I recall.
Yeah, that's right.
But I didn't come across any kind of archaeological evidence that had, you know,
That suggested that, yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
not that I'm aware of. Yeah. Paul, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the scholar or his book, but there was a scholar, I think in the 50s, who put forward the thesis that the pharaohs were all black, and advanced, you know, a very contrarian view. And I think this was a black scholar, and basically advancing the claim that black people were the source of all Western civilization, because everybody took from Africa. It caused a lot of controversy, and no one ever took it up.
Africans are very diverse. You know, like genetically, West Africans and East Africans are further apart than East Africans from most Europeans, you know. So it's a bit generic to say, oh, they're African, you know, but
Right.
possibly from an African tribe, yeah.
I mean, we do have evidence of I think it's the 25th dynasty, 26th dynasty, so later dynasties of the Nubian princes actually becoming pharaohs, and all, some further south, and all black pharaohs that were ruling over Egypt. But that's, as far as I know, that's the only kind of evidence of, you know, having more of a black skin total pharaohs.
Yeah, I think if I could, I think, Lisa, there were certain dynasties, I guess, what is it, 26th dynasty, where they were from Nubia or Kush, and they were definitely sort of sub-Saharan Africans. There were, yeah, I think maybe the books Paul is talking about, there was one called Black Athena and another called Stolen Legacy, which advanced that. But I understand there were just quite recently, there were some DNAs, they recovered some DNAs from Egyptian mummies, and they found out they were much more closely related to other Middle Easterners than they were to African tribes further south.
Okay. Yeah.
Interesting.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. Okay. All right. I'm going to move us on.
Just a minute, if I could. In fact,
please.
They found out actually that the ancient Egyptians were more closely related to to the other Middle Easterners than Egyptians are today. Egyptians today are a bit more mixed race than the ancient Egyptians were.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Does anybody have any last questions or comments about art? Because I'm going to actually move us on to the Amarna letters in the last 20 minutes. Okay.
No?
No, we're good.
Sorry. Well, okay. Good. Alrighty. So now it's kind of segueing into these things called the Amarna letters. And I wanted to answer general questions about the Amarna letters and also share with you an example. But we're going to talk about what they are, some samples of what they say and who wrote them, where they are found, something about the messengers who are very important in bringing the Amarna letters and why they're so important. What you're seeing here is that urban plan again, and the reason I pulled this up is because around this here 16, which is very close to the Great Palace where the royal court was held, was found it's the place of the correspondence of the Pharaoh. And we know that because it was stamped on foundation bricks that were in the structure. However, when we talk about the Amarna letters, there's a couple of problems with that. And one is that there's conflicting information on how they were actually found, who found them, when they were found, do we have them all? One is that it was a local woman who was out looking for kind of like something that was carbonized so she could use it for her cooking fire. Another one was that local people actually were doing digging so that they could sell things onto the antiquities market. And then the last theory is that it was a private and undocumented excavation altogether. And why this is important is because the Amarna letters first came to notice because of people finding things on the antiquities market in Egypt. So it wasn't that there was an archaeologist out digging and found this stash of the Amarna letters. It was because someone got clued in that there are these things. They trace back to where the origin was supposed to be, and then an archaeological expedition went out and started looking for these letters. So it's a little problematic about their origin story. And because of this, dating and the chronology is extremely difficult to ascertain. So there's a lot of mystery around these letters. So what are the Amarna letters? This is what they look like. There's about 400, give or take, clay tablets, and they are written in Akkadian cuneiform mostly, but there's a couple of examples written in other languages. It's correspondence between Egypt, Egyptian vassal states, and Near Eastern rulers. It's not only letters, though. There are also lists and epics and syllabaries and lexical texts and other things that are recorded on these clay tablets. And there is suspicion that they may have been used to learn cuneiform. And then the time period is from Amarna. This is where they are actually discovered, is in Amarna. And that's again, the 18th dynasty. And they cover people think between 30 and 15 years and all. But why these are so important is because Akkadian cuneiform is kind of the lingua franca for diplomatic correspondence. And what's learned is that there was a lot more diplomacy that was happening in this particular point in time than had previously been understood. We didn't have these kind of records. So this was a wealth of information. And you could see where Egypt was interacting with all these various people from throughout the ancient Near East. So it was a really phenomenal find, and it has changed the perception of Bronze Age diplomacy.
They're hugely important for that reason. And they define what scholars have called the Club of the Great Powers. right? Because you see in there some number of ranks. So for example, there were certain people, and maybe you're getting there.
I am getting there. Yeah.
Well, then I'm not going to go there. So I'll come in later then. You go.
Okay, thank you. Alrighty. So before we do get to that, because Paul he's my plant on this part of it, is that I wanted to show you a map so you could see kind of where these letters are actually coming from. And although this map is specific to a certain set of people that are referenced during in some of these letters, a lot of these letters actually, the Habaru people who were disruptors of the region. They were considered raiders and pirates, nomadic peoples and all. But it does show that there were letters that came from this smaller kingdom, Arzawa. There were letters that came from the Hittite Empire, letters from Mitanni Empire. There was Assyria is coming onto the scene, and we'll have letters from Assyria. There's letters from the area of Babylon under Kassite rule and all. And then you have most of the letters are coming from Egyptian vassal states, which is going to be in this area here, the Levant area. And all. And I just want to quickly just point out, you see all of these letters. There's a lot of letters that come from the king of Byblos, and he is writing to the Pharaoh Akhenaten for help. And I'll get to an example of one of his letters. You know, so who ruled during this time? And I think this is a great segue into what Paul was talking about, is that there is this great powers club. And I'm just showing them here. And what I wanted to just share with you is kind of like who's the ruler and who is the pharaoh that receives their correspondence. Because one thing I forgot to mention is that the majority of these letters are actually being received by the court at Amarna. They are not letters that the pharaoh has written himself. And one of the kingdoms is Alicia, or modern day Cyprus. I put my own take on what the tone of the letters are and the reasons why. And this is just based on a couple of weeks of study that I did in a class. But the tone that comes across from the king of Alicia is there's confidence, and there's a reason for it. They have a critical resource that Egypt needs, and that's copper. The kingdom of Arzawa, if you remember, that was in the Western Anatolia or Turkey area, is a smaller kingdom. The ruler is Tarhun Daraba, and he's writing to Amenhotep III, and he comes across as being very inexperienced. He doesn't have the right kind of like greeting, and he actually is reprimanded by the pharaoh, and comes across again as being very inexperienced. The king Ashur-uballit of Assyria is writing to Akhenaten, and while he is the new guy on the block, he comes across as being extremely confident, and he expects to be part of this, great powers club right off the bat, and kind of demands that. Babylon, we have two of the kings there, Kadamash Enlil the first and Berniabash the second, and they are over their reign writing to Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun, it is thought. They're coming across with, we're on the same playing field as you are, Pharaoh, and they have distance and wealth as kind of their reasons for being so confident. The Hittites, the supplier of the letter is Supuliyama the first. And in terms of like who's on the receiving end, I had a hard time finding that information conclusively. So I just put some question marks there because I didn't find any translations actually in the text that I was reading. And then the last one is the kingdom of Mitanni and Tushratta. And I'll be sharing an example of Tushratta's correspondence with the pharaoh Akhenaten. But he's writing to Amenhotep III, Queen T, which is important, Akhenaten. And he comes across as becoming more and more desperate, and he comes across as being very needy. So what are these letters doing at Amarna? Because remember, the site of Amarna, this sacred landscape, is the doings of Akhenaten, right? And yet a lot of these letters are addressed to Amenhotep III, who we're not quite sure if he actually resided at Amarna or not. Some believe that there is evidence that he did, and others don't believe that. So the jury's kind of out on that one. If we think about it, these are clay tablets. They're unwieldy to transport. And the fact that they're written in cuneiform and in Akkadian means that an extraordinarily small number of people will be able to really understand them. So why are they there? A couple of the theories are that the letters contain promises and requests and gifts and tribute that maybe Akhenaten needs to verify or have a reference to for the future. So they may have been written and stored at actually Thebes, and then he is taking them with him when he moved the court. That's one theory. Another theory is that they are simply historical reference, just to have that history of what has transpired before. So something similar, but more focused on just the historical knowledge. Another is that it's actually used as a learning library for scribes. It's cuneiform, so copying things. And then the reason why people are kind of doubting whether this is truly like the cache of all this correspondence is because if it was something that needed to be referred back to for the Pharaoh and the court, it would have been transcribed in all likelihood into Egyptian hieroglyphs, because more people would be able to read that, and onto papyrus for storage. Think about transporting these huge clay tablets, not huge, but these clay tablets, some of which are small enough that they were written in, on the palm, the size of a palm. But it doesn't seem like it's very practical. So there's a lot of debate right now about why this stash of letters has actually been found and what they were intended to be for Akhenaten. I'm moving on to themes, and Paul, at any time you want to interject on any of this stuff, because I think I'm touching on some of the tone stuff now that you were bringing up, please do. But there are different kind of themes that are cropping up depending on who's writing to the pharaoh. So in the vassal states, there is the ones that are more dependent upon Egypt and less independent are writing about the compliance with requests that they have done in order to support the pharaoh's requests. They may be confirming that I'll be sending taxes, or here are the taxes, or I'm sending labor for efforts in building in Egypt. They may be confirming that they're able to support troops that are going to be coming from Egypt into that region. For those more independent vassal states, they're actually making requests. They're asking for material goods. They're complaining about neighboring states and needing aid. They're complaining about requests that the pharaoh has made, specifically Byblos. And then they're also revealing to the pharaoh what's happening politically. So who are these Habaru people that are coming in and coming into their world? Who are their neighboring kings or governors, and what are they doing at the time? So there's a great deal of information that is exposed in these Amarna letters, right? And then for the great powers, we have kind of an attitude that depends on who's writing. There are reminders of brotherly love, and when a king is on equal status with another king, they refer to each other as brothers. There are admonishments for skimpy gift greetings, and oftentimes, or all the time, when the relationship was good, the letter writers would send gifts along with their letters. And so some of these letters come across as they're mad because they didn't get very much from the pharaoh. And then there's a lot of requests for gold and for princesses. It's really gold to kind of influence their coffers, and then princesses so that they gain a great deal of status among the neighboring kingdoms, because to have an Egyptian princess just was not done. And so there's a series of letters that are really interesting where a king, and I can't remember which king it is asking the Pharaoh for one of his princesses so that he can really rise up in stature, because no Egyptian Pharaoh has ever given a princess away in marriage. The tone, those are some of the themes, and then the tone from those vassal states that are really independent of Egypt. Their kind of like opening greeting is very simple. It is, say to the king of Egypt, the message of so-and-so, which king? We fall at the feet of my lord. Versus this, which is much more groveling, you're my lord, my son, my God, my son from the sky. I'm your servant. I'm the dirt at your feet. I am the ground, the mire you tread on. I will fall at your feet 7 times on my stomach and on my back. So a very different interpretation of, where they are viewed in terms of kind of the pecking order by the Pharaoh.
It's also, I would imagine, a question of what they just did. So I would look at that second letter and say that this is a guy that really screwed up. And he's now begging for his life.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah,
he's
that's
flattering
a good point.
for all he's worth.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And because, as you mentioned, one of the main subjects of these letters is to complain about the neighboring king, and to say how the neighboring king is doing something that's against the interests of Egypt, because Egypt doesn't care if he's doing something against the interest of some small state in the Levant. So this sounds like someone that is propitiating for all he's worth.
That is an excellent point. Thank you for bringing that up. And there's a couple of other reasons why, some of the vassal states have more confidence than other. And one is geography.
Yeah.
Some of the vassal states are further removed from Egypt, so less likely if they cause problems to actually have Egyptian military go out and kind of quell a rebellion, for instance. There is a strategic location or resource, like the island of Cyprus, for instance. They had copper. And so Egypt needed that resource, although they were considered a great power. But that's an example of, if one of these vassal states has something that Egypt wants, they're going to have more confidence. Can that vassal state be claimed by another kingdom? Like, Mitanni is right next to the Levant area. So is Mitanni basically saying that these are actually part of my people? They're not Egyptians, Egyptian vassal state. And then the last is, are these vassal states being wooed by another power like the Hittites? The Hittites did a lot of kind of like trying to steal from Egypt the city states that are under their domain. And so if the Hittites are coming to them and saying, hey, be part of our empire, or I'm going to take you by force as part of my empire, then the king is going to pay closer attention to it.
So this was serial. In other words, these states were always a buffer between Egypt and whoever was the dominant state to the north. Yeah. And that was first Mitanni. And then basically the Hittites wiped out Mitanni, made them into just a puppet kingdom, and they took the place of Mitanni in these things. And so I would imagine that one major thing was how close you were to, the king that wanted to project power into there. And there was, it was an ebb and flow back and forth of, so for example, Thutmose the third conquered all the way to the Euphrates. He was the greatest Egyptian conqueror. But then the Mitanni, basically, they drove down almost to the borders of Egypt. Usually they kind of met in the middle and fought, battles in which it was not clear who won, except the Egyptians would always claim that they won them.
Yes, they were very good at that.
Lisa?
Yes.
A couple of comments. One is, I think the gold as a matter of trade was interesting because the eastern mountains of Egypt along the Red Sea coast were, I think, the major source of gold in this. Mesopotamia had no gold, no silver, no minerals at all. And very few other places had much gold. So Egypt, and I guess everybody, I mean, gold is useless, but even by this point, kind of everybody liked it. I guess it was the bling at that time as it is now. So that was something. Everybody wanted gold from Egypt, and Egypt wanted to get as much as they could in return for their gold. So that's right. So that was a major Egyptian export that they could use.
One of the letters is from the king of Babylon, and he says, "My brother, why don't you give me gold? It's like sand in the street where you are."
That's right. Everybody thought that Egypt was just swimming in gold because that's where most of the gold came from. One other comment, I was reading some time ago on Mycenaean Greece. Now, Mycenaean Greece was a fairly rich, powerful state at that point. There were a lot of big temples and a lot of things, but there wasn't a single Amarna letter to Mycenaean Greece. There were certainly contacts between Mycenaean Greece and Egypt, but Mycenaean Greece, while a substantial power in one sense, a substantial civilization, was completely outside of the sort of what you say is the great power network of the Middle East. Thanks.
So I do think that they have found that the Minoans have traces in Egypt, that they sent artisans down, and there are Minoan style wall murals in Egypt.
Absolutely, there were substantial contacts, but there's no reference to any of them in any of the Amarna letters, which is curious because there were a lot of artisanal contacts. You're quite right.
I think we
but they will communicate in cuneiform with the.
And there was no indication that the Achaeans or the Mycenaeans ever mastered cuneiform or Akkadian.
So maybe they communicate in another language, and this was a section of cuneiform, and in 2 rooms next to was something else. Because if there were big important places that they trade, I'm sure that they have communication with them.
Well, you would think so, but and there are some tablets from Mycenaean Greece, but no traces of correspondence with Egypt. It's conceivably they had some other form and in some other place, but there's no indication of them, despite this very voluminous correspondence among these other Middle Eastern states.
I mean, it's you might think about the story of the Trojan War and see what was the nature of Mycenaean diplomacy, which was piratical. There are references in the Hittite record, in Hittite archive, to the Achaeans, the Achiawa as they call them, and they're all none of them are pleasant. The Achaeans were they took the city of Miletus, which was called Milawanda at that time, and they were trying to conquer Western Asia Minor, and there was a flow back and forth. And there were some letters from the king of the Hittites to the king of the Achaeans, basically saying, "Can't you control these people that are coming and conquering my territory?" And the Achaean king was kind of playing it very very non-committal. He was not stepping up and responding in a positive way to the requests from the king of the Hittites.
So folks, I'm going to do a quick time check because I do have about 10 more minutes worth of content, and I am happy to stop now or keep going.
10 minutes. I think you should keep going. This has been great, and you should finish.
Keep going.
Sure,
okay.
keep going.
Okay, we'll keep going. Alrighty. So great discussion, guys. Thanks, and gals. Thanks so much for interjecting. I really appreciate that. In terms of like the tone from the great powers, we do have different tone as well. We have very respectful, we have demanding, as I think Ralph pointed out about give me that gold, or Paul pointed out about giving me the gold, you know, you've got so much of it, it's like dirt. There's a level of, especially from a couple of letters from Babylonian kings, that they're very shrewd, very conniving, and in my mind, very skilled in diplomacy, actually, which I found very interesting. And then, especially from the king of King Tushratta from the Mitanni kingdom, there's some level of shame that he's coming across as he's very ashamed because of something that happened. And what had happened was he had asked, and I'll get into the more details, but he had received a gift of gold from Akhenaten. And he was so thrilled of having this gift of gold that he wanted to kind of unveil it while he had held court of all of these foreign dignitaries that were gathered around him, and I'm imagining like a feast or something. And he actually like opened up this gift of gold and found that it was hardly anything that he was expecting, that its quality was very poor, and that when it was actually like that when they actually refined it or something, it amounted to like hardly anything. And here he had like made this big production of revealing it in front of these foreign dignitaries, and then it amounts to nothing. So he lost face in front of some others. So I thought that was quite interesting to see that come across through these, you know, texts from so long ago. I'm going to switch us on then to the role of the messengers, and I bring these guys into the story because they are extremely important. And their role was basically as the diplomat, as the king's representative. So one thing you have to consider is that likely these kings, these great powers, will never have met face to face. So they are using an intermediary through which their word is being communicated. These individuals are also the guardian and escort of the greeting gifts, which, you know, some lists of greeting gifts are like pages and pages long. And it's not, you know, just like I'm sending you this, you know, this linen. It is, I'm sending you this gold and this silver and this ornamentation for a chariot. And by the way, 5 chariots. So enormous amounts of goods were being sent back and forth. And there is also a possibility that these letters were read out loud. They were not just presented to, say, an interpreter in court, but they were actually may have been read out loud. And so now there's one art historian that I was reading. She said, we really need to consider these not just as, you know, texts, as ancient texts, but also as artifacts, as actual like art artifacts, and important for us to think about the ceremony and the pomp and circumstances around it. So who were they? Some could be family. There were people that were the pharaonic stand-ins, so people that were very high up in the court. They could be a potential hostage, and that is an interesting fact, because in the event that, say, a messenger has been sent by one of the kings, and the message is not what the recipient king wanted to hear, or maybe the greeting gifts were not what they were expecting, they could hold the messenger hostage, which was really a hardship for the pharaoh or the king, right? So there was a number of accusations against Akhenaten where he actually held messengers from other kings hostage. They were requested. These were people that were extremely high up, and they would actually be requested by name because they were trusted by both the sender as well as the receiver. So receivers would say, don't send that messenger. That person doesn't know anything. Send this messenger because I trust that person. Now I'll get into just to a couple of examples, and I'll start with this kind of summary letter that's sent by King Tushratta to Akhenaten. And he has a lengthy correspondence of about 12 letters, I guess, with Amenhotep III, Queen T, and then Akhenaten. And in this particular letter, he summarizes basically all of the problems that he's had with Akhenaten. And first off, he's saying, talk to your mom, Queen T. She knows everything, and meaning that your father Amenhotep had promised me gold, lots of it, and your mom knows all about this. So ask her because she knows. And your father had promised that I would have gold statues that were fashioned in my likeness as well as my daughter's likeness. You sent me statues, but they were nothing. They were wooden statues and they were gilded, and that was it. And so I was really distressed about that. And then he kind of turns a little bit more, begging in that he's look, I'm building this huge mausoleum to honor one of my ancestors, and I need that gold. And gold is plentiful as dirt. And then he accuses Akhenaten of detaining his messengers. Remember, they're like hostages, and he's denouncing him for this. And then lastly, he does send greeting gifts, but he does say, I didn't want to have to write this, but you made me, basically is what he's saying. These golden statues crop up again and again in his complaints to Akhenaten because he never gets those gold statues, I don't think. And as the letters go on in what's the suspected chronology, he becomes more and more like desperate and really begging Akhenaten to send him gold. This is a letter from the Assyrian king Ashur-uballit to Akhenaten. Again, remember, Assyria really hasn't been a big player yet. They're coming onto the scene, and he is basically coming right out of the gate and being quite demanding. And he's saying things like, hey, gold in your country is dirt. Why are you so sparing of it? I'm the equal of the king of the Mitanni kingdom, but what you sent me, it won't even cover the costs that my messengers have for going there and coming back. Your messengers have been delayed, but that's because I'm doing you a service by protecting them from mortal danger. And this is a group of pursuers that evidently are after them. And then another accusation against Akhenaten about having the messengers stand out in the exposed sun and die in the sun. So a really interesting tone from a new player. And he kind of skips the niceties and goes right to, you need to send me stuff.
At the same time as this is happening, there are letters from the king of Babylon basically protesting that the king of Assur dares to consider himself to be a brother, to be a great king. And he demands that they be treated as, as a minor player.
I think I can't remember which king it is of Babylon, but don't they also request that that person be kind of ignored?
Yes.
Like don't align with him.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yep. But basically, the Assyrians from the east and the Hittites from the west were eating the Mitanni alive. And when the Mitanni were gone, it was just the Assyrians facing off against the Hittites.
Yep. Alrighty, and this is let me see, one of the last ones here. This is that King Rib-Hadda from Byblos, and I think it's written to Akhenaten, but I don't know that it's confirmed. And we see here a little bit of what's happening in the political sphere, and the king of Byblos is pushing back on Akhenaten. That's basically, telling him to, you gotta be on your own guard. You gotta guard against the enemies that are coming into your territory. And the king of Byblos is basically saying, who can guard me? You're not sending me help. I'm your vassal state, but you're not sending me help. How can I survive if no one's here to guard me? And then he's also saying, if you want your lands to be secured and you're concerned about them, then you got to send me a garrison until you are able to send archers and bring peace to these lands. So there's like so many letters that come from King Rib-Hadda to Akhenaten, just begging him for help and also pushing back on any request that Akhenaten is making to him. And then I'll just end with, kind of what are obscure endings. And I think somebody mentioned, was Nefertiti, Paul, was Nefertiti like a co-ruler? And there are a couple of things here I'll share with you. And first is in year 16, Akhenaten, during his reign, he kind of unravels. And that's when he actually goes on an attack against the Theban deity Amun. Nefer-Aten, the Nefertiti maybe, is designated a co-ruler. There is the brief reign of Smenkhare, who may or may not be the son of Akhenaten. And then Akhenaten and Nefertiti at the end they themselves are erased from history, or there's an attempt to erase them from history. But the belief reforms, those are left in place, and those take time to change back into something that's more in the traditional line that predated Akhenaten's reign. And this here is from King Tutankhamun's restoration stele. So this is going to be the pharaoh, two removed from Akhenaten, or one removed from Akhenaten. And it is suspected that he is an offspring of Akhenaten. And he basically is telling us, how much in dire straits the kingdom of Egypt is, that the temples have been ignored. There's weeds growing in the temples, that there is a serious illness that has ravaged the country, that the gods have abandoned the land. And if ever we were to send any kind of a military out, it would fail outside of Egypt's borders and all. And then he ends with, their hearts had become weak in their cultic bodies, the statues of the gods, because they, Akhenaten and his followers, had destroyed those man-made things. So there is a real intense and concerted effort to basically say Akhenaten and his reign, they were horrible and left the country in just dire straits and all. This here, what you're seeing, is from the Valley of the Kings, Tomb 55. Why I'm showing this is because it is suspected that this may be the pharaoh Smenkhare, or it may be the pharaoh Akhenaten, or it may even be, they suspect, maybe Nefertiti. It's unconfirmed who this mummy is. It was greatly damaged by the elements. When it was found, it was not well handled. And also, to top it off, is the face has been chiseled away, and it wasn't just to get gold, because you see gold is remaining here on the rest of the statue, on the rest of the sarcophagus, but the face is completely taken off. It was someone that wore the Egyptian crown, because they have the pharaonic beard as well as the uraeus with this cobra. And also what's been chipped off is the cartouche with the name of the pharaoh that would be, or the queen that is residing within this sarcophagus. So unsure who is in Tomb 55. So stay tuned, because they're always doing more and more research on this and all. And then I'll just leave here with kind of like my takeaways in this, and that I just find that the rate of change and innovation and complexity during a very brief period of time, 30 years and less, is unbelievable. And that there was a lasting impact on art and beliefs that maintained throughout history and all. And then also, people have said, was Akhenaten a philosopher? Was he a heretic? Was he a henotheist, meaning somebody that promotes just one deity over all the others? Was he a pacifist? Was he a dictator? And I think that through whatever lens you view it, he could be all of these things really kind of rolled into one. The story is not as straightforward as I think earlier scholarship has projected it to be. And the scholarship, because it's such a popular period of time, because it's so radical, it changes every year. So I guess stay tuned. And with that, I'll just project this if anyone wants to take a screenshot, but these are some of the resources that I use to prepare the content. And that's it.
Thanks. It's great.
Yeah, really excellent.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
This was really
You're welcome.
detailed.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. I have one question. Why didn't this reform stick? Why wasn't Amenhotep was able to kind of have a lasting? Was it mostly because he actually forced people to follow this, and then they didn't really, the whole populace didn't accept it?
Yeah, really interesting question. So if you remember back to kind of the beginning of the presentation, and I showed like those little cult statues of Bes and Tower set, so different deities, those were found at Amarna itself. Even in some of the imagery of the courtiers of Akhenaten's court, there are images of other deities. So this whole concept of worshiping really at the expense of all other deities, the Atsun, it didn't grab hold even during his reign. So it is believed that when Akhenaten left the court, moved his court from Thebes to Amarna and set up Amarna, that he took a very select group of people that were willing to kind of follow in his footsteps, but it was a select group of people. And then he had this population of about anywhere from 20,000 to 50,000 individuals that were kind of forced to move along with the court.
Well, also, you mentioned in the beginning the troika. I mean, the priests were essentially out of business.
Yeah.
I mean, right. And they had an institutional presence that would survive any individual, and Akhenaten did not. So they were able to reassert themselves when Akhenaten died.
Yeah.
And was followed by very weak rulers.
Exactly. Yep. Great
Do
point.
we know the reason for his death? It was natural, or was he helped?
Was he helped? I like the way you put that, Mikhail.
Michael Ivanovichuk.
Yeah. As I understand it, I think it was natural causes, but I'm not 100% sure. I don't think that there's any evidence that's been uncovered that he was assassinated.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, if we did, then the Discovery Channel wouldn't have anything to say to you. Right, show after show on who killed Tutankhamun, the mystery.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting how both Amarna period and reformists and all this exchange between different, areas, Mesopotamia and Egypt, was kind of like during this period. It was like almost, you can say this probably golden by physical standard, and also any kind of gold period, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
for one
I want
to
find those gold statues that Tushratta was talking about. I think that's going to be my archaeological goal. Where are those gold statues?
For one thing, what was going on there is that the Egyptians were recovering from, being ruled by the Hyksos, and the Hyksos had invaded them from the east, from the Levant, and they changed policy. Egypt had never projected power into what is now Palestine and Syria. And they realized that this was a grave threat to them. So a lot of what you see, this engagement, is the fact that Egypt realizes that they have to, that they can't defend themselves unless they get involved. And they have to set up buffer states, and they have to project power into that region, because otherwise they'll get conquered again. The other thing is that the nature and the changes of warfare. The Mitanni introduced the battle chariot to the world, or at least to the ancient Near East. And the point is that the Egyptians who caught up, they had no horses, they did not have wood, right? You don't have trees that grow in Egypt. So they were tremendously dependent on being able to import these things in order to be able to stay in the game. So they were forced to engage in a way that they had never engaged in under the Middle Kingdom or the the Old Kingdom.
Yeah.
And I cannot help but to mention that it's about 150 to 200 years before Moses coming out of Egypt. Of course, no proof historical, but.
Well, you know what Freud did. You know, Freud wrote Moses and Monotheism, in which he declared, you always got to distrust psychoanalysts when they write about history. You know, let them write about psychoanalysis. And
Yeah.
you know, and he declared that you know that Akhenaten was the first monotheist, and Moses had been assassinated by the Hebrews. You know, if you ever read it, it's kind of silly stuff.
So I guess question to Judy Taylor: Did you like our group? Did we pass? Do we pass?
I put you on the spot.
I loved it. I mean, I can't believe how detailed and how informative it was. I mean, this is just amazing. And Lisa, you say you're not an expert. I mean, this is not your profession.
I don't know. It's, you know, Lisa, I think, was born historian. It's just she chose a different profession.
You know, one interesting thing about the Amarna letters is that, as far as I can see, the Amarna letters show no traces of what's going on with Akhenaten. They, you know, to the extent that there's a revolution going on, the Amarna letters are completely business as usual. There's no difference between the way they address Amenhotep III and the way they address Akhenaten. So it was purely a domestic Egyptian episode.
And interesting also in Amarna letters, to your point, business as usual, but also there's a lot of wedding skirmishes are being discussed in the Amarna letters. One of the, I believe it was Babylonian king or Assyrian one, writes that there might be a daughter of his lost in the, you know, in Pharaoh's harem, and he doesn't know she's there. He's like, what are you talking about? I don't have your.
I think this is when he also complains that his messenger is not coming back to him that he sent to find out how his daughter is.
Yeah, and he said, I don't have your daughter. I said, what are you talking about?
Yeah. There was one of the letters where a king does write to the Pharaoh and says, you know, I don't know if she's alive. I don't know if she's dead. And I seem to recall that there was a response back that there is actually an Amarna letter copy of, which indicates that you need to send the right messenger, right? Remember how I mentioned that the messenger is really important, that they understand what's happening, because the messengers you sent, they don't even know what your daughter looks like, you know? So how on earth could they tell you that she is actually there or not? So yeah, I mean, if anybody is interested in like drama, I'm telling you, you got to read the Amarna letters. They are absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
So much
Priceless
drama.
documents.
Priceless. Absolutely fascinating reading.
Yeah, and then you can see the behavior of different kings, pharaohs, you know, around the area, and how demanding they were. Like, well, you send us gold right now, ASAP.
Well, but they were really whining, you know. I mean, because they had no leverage. You know, there were no threats. They weren't going to cross, you know, and invade Egypt. They were, you know, they were powerless. So
right.
they were whining essentially.
Right.
And they didn't feel there's going to be negative repercussions, right?
Like, what are you going to do? I'm holding a treasury.
Right. I'm not going to poke the bear, kind of thing.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So the you know, the bridal traffic was always one way.
Yeah.
Brides going to Egypt, not coming
Never
back.
otherwise. Yeah.
Until there was that one case where I think it was Hatshepsut promised a daughter to the son of the king of the Hittites, and when he came to get her, he was assassinated. Which
no, that was are you thinking of when the wife, sorry?
It's a Hittite son from a Hittite.
Yeah, I said the Hittites sent a son, and he was assassinated. But you know, the Egyptians said they were going to give a daughter, which they never do. And then when he showed up, he didn't end up with the daughter. He ended up dead.
On the road, yeah, he got killed conveniently. Yeah.
Well, I think the Amarna letters are the letters that they kept. You know, maybe the Hittites, they have letters from the Pharaoh begging for something too. So everybody keeps whatever they want.
Right. You could
Yeah.
imagine the Pharaoh was begging for horses.
Yeah, maybe. So,
Right. Or, you know, right.
but
Or
they didn't keep those letters.
timber or horses or anything that they were lacking, correct?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And then
And
again,
luxury goods, right? You know, the lapis lazuli, the linen, fine linens, because there's also like really high quality wool, not cotton, but wool that's coming in from certain areas that they coveted as well. So, yeah.
this is
Does anybody have any other like questions or comments?
no, I think this was really amazing. I appreciate it.
Yeah, this was great.
Yeah.
I have a question. Is it possible to see this recording later and also previous ones?
Recording, I'm gonna post it to the YouTube channel we have about all the ones that we did, about 80 lectures, not lectures, discussions. We posted them all on YouTube channel, and I will post the link to the YouTube channel on Meetup. But if you want to see our website for all the, we have Instagram, we have Facebook, we have Twitter for this group. It's called omnicarta.org, and I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you.
And the videos are also on the website.
Thank you, Zach, for doing all this. Huh?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I hope
It's a
there are
lot of
more
work,
coming
Zach.
after this.
Yeah.
Yeah, we like this week, because Mother's Day, we actually don't have anything on a weekend. But next week we have a bunch of good ones. So do stay tuned and look at our meetup. I think I will schedule. We have Edward the First, the English monarch. We're starting with Roman, the first kings. You know, we have a lot of good ones. We're gonna do medieval music, which I moved to due to the scheduling conflict. But we have a lot, even this month. Oh, and then Alisa is gonna do one or Etruscans. How about that?
Mm.
How about that? Not a lot.
Forward to.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So interesting. These guys, oh my gosh, yeah. It was hard to keep focused on the Amarna period when I've got the Etruscans. I'm like, oh my gosh, they're so interesting too.
I got Etruscans. I mean, it's just, you know, and he'll talk about it, so I don't want to open my mouth.
Yeah. so much to learn and stuff. So
Right. I appreciate it.
well, thanks for staying on, everybody. It was great. Appreciate your time.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Bye,
Great
everybody.
presentation, Lisa. Thanks,
Great.
Lisa. Thanks, Zach.
You're
you.
welcome.
Thanks, everybody.
Ciao,
Thank you.
ciao.
Nice to see you. Bye.
Bye.